evening on this nice summer night where it's not raining. I know it's difficult to stay inside on those few evenings where there isn't inclement weather, so appreciate you sticking around. As you can see from the title of the presentation, it's going to be a little bit of a departure from some of the SEO presentations you may have seen already. I just wanted to say a quick note of thanks to Bill. Jamshedji? Perfect. Right on. Thanks. For his great presentation and for allowing me to come here and speak to you guys this evening. I just want to give you a little bit of an introduction to myself. My name is Brendan Tully Walsh, as written on the board. And I work for an agency in Montreal called Brendan and Brendan, in which I am partners with another Brendan who is standing to my left over here. Brendan's here. Yes, so he's going to make sure he's making sure that I keep it real, and he also made sure that I wore my Keep Marketing Fun shirt, which, despite the heat that's blowing from the projector, I'll try to stay cool at all times. Presentations, from my perspective as a writer, are just as good when they are one way as when they are many different directions. So if you find at any point in this discussion, which is going to get a little bit, I'll say, blasphemous, feel free to weigh in, and I really do hope I don't offend anybody and everyone takes it in the spirit that it's intended. So I'm going to fare forth into my journey into an ecumenical departure on SEO. SEO and the seemingly endless debate surrounding it is at once an essentially modern concept, but also very much reminiscent of the great theological debates of the ages, replete with sages, prophets, profiteers, marketers, mysteries, and unknowables. It plays so closely to the handbook of ancient theology that it requires a little bit of, or at least demands seemingly, at least a suggestion and a touch. And I'm going to get into some of the people who have already touched on those comparisons, but I think most people who've thought deeply on the subject can at least see a humoristic connection between the two things. Everything from the concept that Google is God to SEO is dead. It plays closely to that handbook, but it also has a cast of characters that I think we've all seen at some point or other. Some of them very much leaders in their fields, other self-proclaimed experts that kind of lead their tribes to some kind of unknown, enlightened promised land of SEO. Certainly, I think anyone who looks at the subject knows that there's no one answer when it comes to SEO, and it's a continuous process, and it's not for the faint of heart, but the people who are very perseverant in the work that they're doing. And there are a whole bunch of other components to that as well. My partner Brendan presented on SEO at the SEO Meetup camp earlier last week, talking a lot about some of our philosophy as a marketing company related to SEO. And so this is far off in left field, but if you feel at any point you want to bring it down to earth, I'm more than happy to do it in the context of content marketing and how we feel about its importance in relation to that. So with that, I'm going to take a theological approach, look through a theological lens at SEO, and I hope you can take my blasphemous comments with as many grains of salt as they're intended, and so forth into the journey of knowing the will of Google. So what could theology tell us about SEO? And if your basic instinct is to say, not with you, I'm not buying this comparison. By the way, two subjects that I really don't know that very much about, but more on the subject later on. I'm going to answer the question with another question. Why ask the question at all? And that's a pretty good question. The fact is, we just can't help it. Anybody who studies more recent and trending kind of neuroscience perspectives knows that the brain is actually an analogy machine. It's one of the best ways we have of actually explaining the universe around us. So everything from kids who are watching Sesame Street, one of these things is not like the other, to people who are trying to express their great love for their romantic other. Your face is like a summer day. Analogy helps us explain the universe both poetically and in terms of cognition. So we're constantly looking for connections. We're constantly using it to draw on experiences and help inform new ones. So really, once you've got that concept involved, pretty much any area of study deserves another lens to look through it. And we see that, I forget the fellow's name, but the head technologist and philosopher at Google is firmly in that camp as somebody who's had a technology upbringing, but also forwards. He also was a PhD of humanities and has studied the classics and all that good stuff. And I think that that's pretty critical. It's a potentially rewarding exercise in and of itself. You guys will be the determiner of that, because that's really what the measure of this presentation is about. Bottom line, It's fun. That's my measure of most things. If it's not fun, I really don't feel like doing it that much, and that's what helps us find our flow as a business. Evidently, we're not the first people to think this. As you do a little bit of Googling on the subject of Google is God, you find something called the churchofgoogle.org, which is a kind of a lovingly put together funny joke on the idea of Google and why it should be positioned as such in its kind of a godlike status. Anybody who uses it has that feeling of, this is something more than anything I've ever experienced in terms of its grandiosity. And so they went through the exercise of kind of establishing that as a position that was tenable. Great minds do think alike. Fools seldom differ, and I'm going to go through their well-made case on the 9 proofs of why Google is God. So it's the closest thing that we have to omniscient. Anything? True? Yes. Omniscient being all-knowing. It's more knowing than anybody else. Does it really know it? No, but it's a pull-knowing, omniscient engine. It's omnipresent. It's not really omnipresent. It's not in my hands right now, but if I move over to my computer or to my smartphone or anywhere in the world that has an internet connection, I get access to Google. So from that perspective and in that argument, it does play that role. I'm going to go through the rest of them. Answers prayers, not really. It answers searches. Google is potentially immortal. It's not any more immortal than this table. If anybody turns off the machine, like Marshall McLuhan said we might do at some point, it's done. So that's something that we do have control over. It remembers all. It certainly has huge data banks, many of which I think it's probably sharing in a giant facility in Utah right now with the NSA and those fucking fellas. Zettabytes, big zettabytes over there. Google does no evil. That's the only one there that I really think actually maps the best to the concept of Google as God. There is actually morality entwined within the concept of it, and I think it's also one of the essential components of trying to figure out what is good SEO. What is good SEO and what is good theology really align on that very point. That if you can get some of the operating principles of Google, you can get some of the operating principles of how you can generate good SEO for yourself just by doing the right things, because they're really about doing the right things. My partner talked about black hat versus white hat. You can read volumes on that stuff, and it gets really quite quickly into the weeds, and then you start to think to yourself, do I need to hire an SEO expert? We don't believe so, although we think that it really depends on your business. Some businesses really depend on extremely meticulous SEO work, and others less so, and it again depends on the kind of work that you're doing. Particularly if you're selling widgets online, it can relate to that. I've blocked out the other 2 points of their proofs for why Google is God, because they're visual. So Google has better SEO than all gods and religions combined, and it's not really approved. But God, Jesus, Allah, Buddha, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, they all fail miserably on the SEO side of things. Obviously, Google's biased. Anyway, it's all there in Google Analytics. But let's move aside from the silly concepts of it and move to what we think the reasons might be to make this blasphemous connection. If anyone, does anyone here find this a blasphemous line of thinking? If anyone, I mean, and I'm a preacher's son, so I don't know. That's how I feel. Do you guys feel that this is blasphemous? Awesome, right on. Google is a primary determiner of the value, our value, culturally, economically, scientifically. It ranks us all. What appears in the New England Journal of Medicine appears in the New England. If you have that subscription, it's great, it's right there. But for all the rest of us who don't get that subscription, Google determines what's really important when it comes to science. Same thing with economy, same thing with culture, same thing with value and what's trending actually more and more. It's a force unto itself, undoubtedly. We don't have much influence on it. It influences itself. It's sui generis. It rolls and rolls and rolls. Unless we work in the hallowed halls of Google, we are not going to have very much impact on what Google decides to do. Again, it's no less in scale than anything in history, religion, rock music. It doesn't really get threatened by any of those. You could have laughed at rock music. The rock concerts are big. It's essentially unknowable. So now we're getting into a little bit of the juice. I like to get into the juice early, and for that reason, just like a cocktail punch bowl, just watch it peter out through the course of a presentation. But the idea of it being unknowable is, I think, the reason why I decided that this was a presentation that might be worth presenting in this context. And in that sense, it's only somewhat predictable. The other part of it that I think is interesting, and if we get actually into specific faiths, the idea of an Old Testament God versus a New Testament God, we might be able to make the idea that we know that the Old Testament God was an iron fist and would strike people down at kind of the drop of a hat without very much warning. Google didn't used to be that way. They were the opposite. Now they've become that way. So as they become more moral and more following their do not do evil, it's become more of a challenge to actually make sure you're making the right decisions. Google will smell out attempts to game itself more quickly than we're actually able to do it. And I'm not saying all the people that only devote themselves to black hat. Certainly those people are smart, but I don't think that they've got anywhere near the resources that Google does to be able to outsmart them that much more quickly. The impact of being caught out in any of those kinds of things is obviously not even worth exploring, so we're firmly in the white hat thing. So we know that, whether we have proofs or not, the reasons why any reasonable soul, and that is any of us that are involved in internet technology or selling things online or using the internet even for our own personal purposes, that we should be fearful, rational, studious in the pursuit of enlightenment to understand how this engine plays a role in our lives in a very significant way. Why? So I'm going to just stop the presentation at that very point because I'm going to go on a completely different tangent and try to bring it back a little bit. The why question is essential. I believe that when we're very young, our first experience of asking that question actually flicks a switch in our brains in terms of consciousness and cognition, where we're starting to question. Now, I happen to have a young son. My partner has young sons as well. I think he's probably deep into the why stage. My son is not quite there, but I understand from pediatric psychologists and cognition experts that between 2 and 4, kids start to generally ask those questions, and then inevitably it's, so why are the bricks red? And well, you know, the soil that the bricks were drawn from, the clay, had red pigment in them. Oh, well, why? Well, because, you know, that was one of the binding chemicals for that particular brand of clay. It could be great. And why? Ad infinitum, right? Some of the approaches that we have to take what I would say just as a kind of good parent, bad parent, there's good answers to why and there's bad answers to why. We don't all do the good answers, we don't always do the bad answers, but here are some of the common ones. So what do you think? Why? I'm going to put you on the spot. What do you think? Engage in that process. It can't be passive. Maybe our experience of Google is passive, but basically my theory is that between what do you think and, because that's how it is, really divides the camps of people and their early experiences of how they deal with the world and how they question things about the world. One of my earliest experiences working in SEO was one of my, I wouldn't call him a mentor, but a colleague who had a bit more experience than I did. He said that anything that we do, we should test. And any result that comes from that test, we should ask questions about, well, why did that happen? Why did that happen? And it relates just as much to PPC as it does to SEM. That we should create hypotheses and we should ask questions about why, and we should really come to the answers. Because if we don't go through that philosophical exercise, we're not really learning anything about SEO. And so that is a little bit part of the philosophy of this presentation anyway, that it's really about engaging in those questions, asking ourselves the right ones, and seeing if we can find the answers. So here's some other common answers, good and bad, to the why question in the why phase of young children. I don't know, but let's try and find out. Like good parents, perhaps there's no right answer, because sometimes there just aren't, and then because I'm your mother. And then maybe because it's God's will. So anyway, that's a judgment on those kinds of things. Here's one. First principles are axiomatic, said my dad. When I asked him 5 or 6 whys in a row, he would say this. And I thought, why? First principles are axiomatic. Why? No, you don't understand. We're down to the roots. We're beyond the weeds, and we're like deep into the kind of groundwater. So he was a person who believed in these kinds of first principles. Why? Because he was an academic theologian for whom God's existence was a given. That was a first principle. And that was a mystery to be unpacked. So the real game was figuring out what this whole thing is about. Not who he was or whether he existed, but what his actual will was and what he wanted for all of us. So that was his thing. Interestingly, his tools were not really that dissimilar from an SEO expert. In the Old Testament, lightning bolts, just saying, no. So dad's tools: faith, reason, study, prayer, testing, beer. Ta-da! Insight. Faith, reason, study, prayer, testing, data. So not that different between the two. There are a whole bunch of tools there. I wouldn't hazard to put them on a page right now because they change every week, but I know the ones I like. And people who are interested in finding the answers to their SEO questions can certainly do a bit of Googling to find out which tools they want to use for their different various purposes. But I think a faith in what Google's essential mission is super important. To use reason, to study. Prayer is always good, especially if you're being paid by clients and you want results that you're hoping that you're going to be able to replicate for them. That's good because we don't know. Testing, 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 and making sure that the data is always there, because you can't test without data and you can't study and reason without it. And beer helps. So we come up with a new concept called Seology. I've heard it before. There's actually a blog called Seology. It's not particularly good based on what I was reading, but I do think it's a term that we can play around with and have a little bit of fun with. I don't need to read through it, but it breaks those two concepts up, adding logia or logi, the Greek idea of the study of, and in this case, systematic rational study of human and machine factors that determine a web asset's placement in the multiverse of the internet. Web assets, I'm not saying web pages. I'm not taking websites, videos, or a blog, all of that stuff, whatever it is that you create. So I'm just going to run through, and this is, I want to give a big shout out to these guys. When I started putting this presentation together, I found that people had already kind of traveled this path before, so I thought I'm not going to reinvent the wheel, but I will kind of try to take their inspiration and define from a theological perspective, you know, who are some of the players in this world. So you can see the giant wheel. Unfortunately, this Google was supposed to flash as an I'm glad it's actually not. But we do have our scientists, we have philosophers, mystics, cultists, heretics, apostates, fundamentalists. They all kind of play a role, and I think on a certain level, anybody who's serious about SEO should really be looking at all of these things. I know that I've very many times been guilty of being the apostate, the denier of SEO and its value. I think that's a mistake, but I think that a balanced approach that really is more about aligning what SEO requirements are needed for your business. All of them have their value, some of them less, some of them more. These two, I think, have the most value, and I think that it's kind of the root of the trunk of the tree, both philosophically and from an SEO perspective. And these are these two characters. People know who these people are, right? Do we know who these people are? They didn't actually live at the same time, apparently. Well, they did. They one taught one another, but the age difference was quite significant. So over here we've got Plato, right, the Platonic method. Much more of a kind of a prosaic, almost poetic type philosopher. Certainly believed in reason, but didn't believe in it as much as the guy who's got the steady hand of Aristotelian, no, we have to kind of prove our principles, and his whole world was divided in trees and shrubs and bushes, and he was all about kind of the canonical and those things that we actually see popping up in SEO all the time. Do we want to be Aristotle or Plato? Maybe a blend of both is really good. Back to the Plato concept, the cave was nothing but a big analogy to explain our existence in the universe and our ability to know it, right? So do we get some inspiration from that? Possibly we do, but I think that this is where the tree both is at its thickest and most valuable, but also where it branches out. We also have these people that are maybe arguably a little bit lazy because they don't actually want to do the hard study. They think that there's maybe a simple key and answer, like the Dan Browns of the world. Dan Brown's a bad example because he's a very smart guy, but the idea that you can somehow dig under the right chest and you're going to find a key that's going to unlock all the secrets of the universe of Google and make your business hum and do all sorts of great things. There actually used to be those things, and they kind of went away. There are some companies who've won enormous amounts of SEO backlink juice and their business essentially online because of early decisions that they made that were really kind of happenstantial, having to do with the way Google, values you in the kind of multiverse of the internet. That you have an enormous amount of backlinks. It may not necessarily determine much about you, and these days that's not important. But companies like Atlassian and anyone who's in technology and uses a product called Jira knows these guys, they never did any PPC, they didn't do any overt SEM, their blog wasn't even that great for the first 10 years, but it was that every time their product spawned itself in a new place, they had a new set of backlinks that were driving back to their product page. So whoa, they're getting more traffic than anybody else just based on that one principle. So that doesn't solve the problem. No one person's quotes, if you're talking about people like Matt Cutts, who says things, and I think he indicates exactly where the direction that Google's going, and you're going to draw from some of those things that, they go back to the kind of moralistic or ethical aspects of what Google's about and what they're trying to do. They're trying to reduce spam, they're trying to reduce porn, they're trying to reduce the junk that's out there, and help us all become better content producers, more authoritative, and stronger in whatever area that we happen to be, so that the content on Google is better. They're making machines do it, but they're trying to emulate